They say every maid dreams of a fairy tale. But in this story, the tale is dark, and the prince, well, he prefers to whisper commands in the dark. When desire slips through marble walls and power hides behind a smile, my dear, don't expect a happy ending. Expect scandal. And I'll be here to tell it. The year 1815 marked the pinnacle of English aristocratic power, where the nobility ruled not merely through birthright but through an intricate web of social protocols that governed every breath, every glance, every whispered word in the marble hallways of power. London's high society existed within gilded mansions that rose like monuments to privilege, their Georgian facades concealing secrets as dark as the coal that heated their grand fireplaces. Within these palaces of influence, the season dictated the rhythm of aristocratic life. From the opening of Parliament in February through the summer months when families retreated to their country estates, every social gathering served as both entertainment and battlefield. Ladies in empire-waisted gowns of silk and velvet moved through these spaces like chess pieces, their every gesture calculated, their smiles weapons as sharp as any blade. The Pemberton dynasty stood among the most formidable of these aristocratic houses. Duke Alexander Pemberton commanded respect through fear, his influence extending from the House of Lords to the private chambers where England's most crucial decisions were made. His associates formed an exclusive circle of power: Marquis Edmund Blackwood, whose financial empire controlled half of London's banking; Earl Theodore Ashworth, whose political machinations had toppled governments; Viscount Charles Whitmore, whose legal expertise had buried countless scandals; and Baron Henry Fitzgerald, whose control over England's shipping routes made him indispensable to the crown. These men gathered regularly at the Pemberton Mansion on Grosvenor Square, a palatial structure that embodied the excess of the Georgian era. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with portraits of ancestors whose own hands had shaped England's destiny. Persian carpets cushioned footsteps on marble floors, while servants in pristine livery moved silently through corridors lined with priceless artwork looted from conquered territories across the empire. The mansion's grand ballroom could accommodate 500 guests, its ceiling painted with scenes of mythological triumph that seemed almost prophetic in their depiction of gods brought low by human ambition. French doors opened onto manicured gardens where peacocks strutted across lawns maintained by a dozen groundskeepers, their cries echoing the vanity of the humans who ruled from within. In this world of absolute privilege, Lady Vesper Pemberton had been raised as the perfect aristocratic daughter. At 22, she possessed the refined beauty expected of her station: auburn hair arranged in elaborate coiffures that required hours to perfect, porcelain skin never touched by common sunlight, and emerald eyes that had been trained from childhood to reveal nothing of her inner thoughts. Her education had been comprehensive yet constrained, designed to make her an ornament to her future husband's ambitions rather than a force in her own right. Every morning began with lessons in deportment, where she learned to walk with books balanced upon her head, her spine straight as a sword blade. Afternoons were devoted to accomplishments deemed appropriate for a lady of her breeding: watercolor painting that captured nothing of life's harsh realities, piano performances that entertained without challenging, and French conversation that allowed her to discuss literature while avoiding any topics that might strain a gentleman's patience. Her wardrobe reflected her status with mathematical precision. Morning dresses of fine muslin with Spencer jackets for receiving callers, afternoon gowns of silk with intricate embroidery for social visits, and evening attire of the finest satins adorned with pearls and precious stones that caught candlelight like captured stars. Each outfit required the assistance of 3 ladies' maids, who laced her into corsets that restricted both breath and movement, transforming her body into the idealized silhouette demanded by fashion. The social calendar that governed her existence allowed no room for spontaneity. Mornings were reserved for correspondence, written in the perfect copperplate hand that had taken years to master. She would pen invitations on cream vellum paper embedded with her family's coat of arms, each word carefully chosen to convey the precise degree of warmth or distance appropriate to the recipient's social standing. Afternoons brought a parade of social obligations: charity committee meetings where ladies discussed the deserving poor while servants served tea from porcelain so fine it was nearly transparent, musicales where young ladies displayed their accomplishments for the approval of potential suitors, and shopping expeditions to Bond Street establishments where merchants bowed deeply before presenting their finest wares. Evenings represented the height of social performance. Dinner parties required knowledge of precedents so complex that seating arrangements could cause diplomatic incidents. Ladies were expected to make conversation that was engaging yet never controversial, intelligent yet never challenging to masculine authority. They spoke of art, literature, and music while carefully avoiding politics, finance, or any topic that might remind their companions that women possessed minds capable of grasping complex subjects. The theater provided another arena for social display, where boxes were arranged according to social hierarchy and opera glasses were used as much for observing other audience members as for watching performances. Lady Vesper had attended countless evenings at Covent Garden and Drury Lane, her attention divided between the staged drama below and the very real intrigues playing out in neighboring boxes. Dancing represented perhaps the most crucial of social skills. The ballroom was where matches were made and fortunes decided, where a poorly executed curtsy could doom a season and a perfectly timed smile could secure a proposal. Lady Vesper had mastered every step of the quadrille, the country dance, and the increasingly popular waltz, despite the scandal it caused among the older generation who considered the close embrace between partners dangerously intimate. Yet beneath this carefully constructed facade of aristocratic perfection, Lady Vesper harbored a secret that threatened to consume her very soul. For 3 years, she had carried the knowledge of what truly happened to her mother, Lady Catherine Pemberton, whose mysterious death when Vesper was 19 had been attributed to a sudden fever that claimed her within a matter of days. The official story, repeated at every social gathering where her mother's memory was mentioned, spoke of a devoted wife who had succumbed to illness despite the best efforts of London's finest physicians. Duke Pemberton had played the role of grieving widower with consummate skill, his sorrow appearing genuine to all who witnessed it. He had commissioned a marble monument in her honor, placed prominently in the family chapel, its inscription praising her as a paragon of wifely virtue and maternal devotion. But Lady Vesper knew the truth, a truth so terrible that it had transformed her from an obedient daughter into something far more dangerous. She had discovered her mother's hidden letters, correspondence that revealed the systematic campaign of psychological torture that had driven Lady Catherine to take her own life rather than endure another day of her husband's cruelty. The letters, written in her mother's increasingly desperate hand, detailed years of manipulation, isolation, and emotional abuse. Duke Pemberton had not merely been unfaithful, he had flaunted his mistresses before his wife, using her devotion as a weapon against her. He had convinced her that her sadness was madness, that her tears were weakness, that her very existence was a burden upon the family name. Most damning of all were the final entries, written in the days before her death, where Lady Catherine had begged God for forgiveness as she contemplated the unthinkable. She had chosen poison over prolonged suffering, seeing no escape from a marriage that had become her prison and a husband who had become her executioner. Lady Vesper had found these letters hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her mother's former sitting room, discovered during the renovation that had erased all traces of Lady Catherine's presence from the house. Reading them had been like experiencing her mother's death again, but this time with the full knowledge of who was truly responsible. The revelation had shattered every assumption Lady Vesper held about her world. Her father, whom she had been taught to revere and obey, was revealed as a monster whose cruelty had driven the woman who bore him a child to self-destruction. The friends who surrounded him, who had sat at their table and accepted their hospitality, had been complicit in their silence, their inaction making them accessories to murder. In that moment of terrible clarity, Lady Vesper had made a vow that would reshape her very soul. She would not seek justice through conventional means, for what court would convict a duke on the word of his dead wife? Instead, she would become an instrument of retribution, using the very weapons that society had taught her to wield: charm, intelligence, and the devastating power of a woman who no longer cared about the consequences of her actions. The transformation had been gradual but absolute. Where once she had been genuinely naive, she now cultivated an appearance of innocence that masked calculating intelligence. Where once her smiles had been spontaneous expressions of joy, they now became tools of manipulation, each one carefully calibrated to achieve maximum effect. Where once her beauty had been simply a gift of nature, she now wielded it like a blade, capable of cutting through the defenses of even the most cynical man. She began to study her targets with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. Duke Pemberton's inner circle became her obsession, their weaknesses and vulnerabilities mapped with scientific precision. She learned their habits, their desires, their secret shames, and their hidden fears. Knowledge became her weapon, seduction her strategy, and silence her shield. The game had begun, though none of her intended victims realized they had already been marked for destruction. In the glittering ballrooms of London's finest houses, Lady Vesper Pemberton continued to perform her role as the perfect aristocratic daughter, even as she planned the systematic annihilation of the men who had failed her mother in her darkest hour. The Blackwood country estate in Hampshire provided the perfect setting for Lady Vesper's first calculated move against her mother's betrayers. The annual autumn house party drew the most influential members of society to a week of seemingly innocent entertainment. Hunting expeditions that allowed gentlemen to display their prowess, elaborate dinners that showcased culinary artistry, and evening entertainments that ranged from intimate musicales to grand balls that rivaled anything London's season could offer. Marquis Edmund Blackwood had inherited not merely a title but an empire built on financial manipulation that stretched across 3 continents. His banking houses in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin controlled the flow of capital that funded everything from shipping ventures to government bonds. At 55, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from a life of absolute confidence. His silver hair and lined face lending him an air of distinguished authority that younger men envied and women found irresistibly attractive. His weakness, Lady Vesper had discovered through months of careful observation, lay in his pride. Blackwood believed himself immune to feminine manipulation, convinced that his vast experience with women had rendered him impervious to their wiles. He collected beautiful companions like fine art, displaying them as symbols of his power while maintaining strict emotional distance. This very arrogance would become the foundation of his downfall. Lady Vesper had arrived at Blackwood Manor dressed in deliberate understatement. While other ladies competed for attention in elaborate gowns of vibrant colors, she had chosen a simple morning dress of pale blue muslin that seemed almost virginal in its modesty. Her hair was arranged in a style that suggested artless simplicity despite requiring 2 hours to achieve, and her jewelry consisted of a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother. The effect was precisely calculated. In a room full of peacocks, she became the dove, her very restraint making her stand out more dramatically than any amount of ostentation could have achieved. Blackwood's eyes had found her within moments of her entrance, his interest piqued by what appeared to be genuine innocence in a world where cynicism was the common currency. Their first conversation had taken place in the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound volumes that Blackwood collected but rarely read. Lady Vesper had positioned herself near a window where the morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, ostensibly absorbed in a volume of poetry that she had selected for its romantic associations. "I confess myself surprised to find someone of your generation interested in classical verse," Blackwood had remarked, approaching with the confidence of a man accustomed to immediate attention. "Most young ladies seem to prefer the more sensational offerings of contemporary authors." Lady Vesper had looked up with just the right degree of startled innocence, as if his presence had caught her completely unaware. "Oh, Lord Blackwood, forgive me. I did not hear you approach. I fear I become quite lost when reading." She had closed the book carefully, her fingers tracing its leather binding with unconscious sensuality. "My mother introduced me to these poets when I was still in the schoolroom. She believed that great literature could teach us about the depths of human feeling in ways that polite society never allows." The mention of her mother had been deliberate, a seemingly innocent reference that would later take on devastating significance. Blackwood had known Lady Catherine Pemberton well, had dined at their table countless times, had witnessed her gradual decline without ever questioning its cause. Lady Vesper watched his face carefully for any flicker of guilt or discomfort, but found only the bland expression of a man whose conscience had been thoroughly corrupted by years of moral compromise. "Your mother was indeed a woman of exceptional refinement," he had replied smoothly. "Her loss was felt deeply by all who knew her. Tell me, do you find comfort in maintaining her interests?" The question had provided Lady Vesper with the perfect opportunity to begin weaving her web. "Sometimes I feel as though she speaks to me through these pages," she had said, her voice taking on a wistful quality that made Blackwood lean closer despite himself. "There are moments when I discover passages that seem to address my very thoughts, as if she had marked them specifically for me to find. This suggestion of mystical connection had clearly intrigued Blackwood, whose rational nature was nevertheless susceptible to romantic notions that flattered his sense of importance. The idea that he might be witnessing something supernatural, that he might be chosen to comfort a grieving daughter whose beauty and vulnerability stirred feelings he had thought himself incapable of experiencing, appealed to both his vanity and his dormant capacity for tenderness. Over the following days, Lady Vesper had skillfully cultivated this impression. She appeared at his side during walks through the estate's formal gardens, where peacocks strutted across manicured lawns and ancient oak trees provided intimate alcoves perfect for private conversation. She sought his advice on matters both trivial and significant, her questions designed to make him feel valued for his wisdom while revealing nothing of her own formidable intelligence. During evening entertainments, she positioned herself where he could observe her throughout the proceedings. She would catch his eye across crowded rooms and offer him smiles that seemed to promise secrets yet to be shared. When other gentlemen attempted to claim her attention, she would respond with polite courtesy while making it clear that her real interest lay elsewhere. The masterstroke came during the hunt, an event that traditionally excluded ladies except as observers. Lady Vesper had appeared at the stables dressed in a riding habit of deep green velvet that emphasized her figure while maintaining perfect propriety. Her horse, a spirited mare that required genuine skill to control, had been selected specifically to demonstrate capabilities that contradicted her appearance of helpless femininity. Blackwood had been surprised to see her mounted and ready to ride. "My dear Lady Vesper, surely you do not intend to join the hunt? The pace can be quite demanding, and the terrain rather challenging for a lady." She had looked at him with wide eyes that managed to convey both gratitude for his concern and gentle disappointment at his assumption of her limitations. "My father taught me to ride before I could properly walk," she had replied softly. "It was one of the few activities he believed suitable for us to share. Since his grief has made him withdraw from such pursuits, I find myself with few opportunities to indulge in what was once our greatest joy together." This reference to her father's supposed grief had been particularly cunning, creating an image of Duke Pemberton as a man devastated by loss rather than liberated by his wife's convenient death. Blackwood, who knew the truth of Pemberton's rapid recovery and immediate return to his mistresses, had felt a flicker of something that might have been conscience. The hunt itself had provided Lady Vesper with multiple opportunities to demonstrate her complexity. She rode with skill that impressed even the most experienced horseman, her control over her mount absolute despite its spirited nature. Yet when they paused to rest, she would reveal knowledge of literature, art, and music that suggested depths far beyond those typically cultivated by young ladies of her station. Most importantly, she had allowed herself to be thrown during a particularly challenging jump, timing her fall to coincide with Blackwood's presence nearby. The accident had been carefully calculated to appear genuine while ensuring no real injury beyond minor bruises, and a dramatically torn riding habit that revealed glimpses of ankle and throat that would have been scandalous under other circumstances. Blackwood had immediately dismounted to assist her, his hands supporting her waist as she attempted to regain her footing. The physical contact, brief though it was, had been electric in its intensity. Lady Vesper had allowed herself to appear shaken, her usual composure momentarily shattered, creating an impression of vulnerability that made even this hardened man of business feel protective. "Perhaps I was overly ambitious," she had whispered, her hand resting briefly on his arm for support. "I fear I allowed my determination to overcome my judgment. It is a failing my governess often criticized." The admission of imperfection, coming from someone who had appeared flawless, had been irresistible to a man whose cynicism had led him to believe that all women were either completely artificial or entirely predictable. Lady Vesper represented something he had never encountered, a woman whose beauty was matched by intelligence, whose strength was tempered by apparent vulnerability, whose innocence seemed genuine despite her obvious sophistication. That evening, as the house party gathered for dinner, Lady Vesper had appeared in a gown that seemed to glow in the candlelight. The fabric, a silk the color of champagne, had been chosen to complement her coloring while suggesting both purity and warmth. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that revealed the graceful line of her neck, where a necklace of topaz and diamonds caught the light with every movement. Blackwood had found himself unable to concentrate on conversation with other guests, his attention drawn repeatedly to the young woman whose presence seemed to illuminate the entire room. When she laughed at another gentleman's jest, he felt an unfamiliar stab of jealousy. When she turned those green eyes in his direction, he experienced a rush of satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity. The evening's entertainment had been a musicale, where young ladies displayed their accomplishments for the approval of their elders. Lady Vesper had initially declined to perform, claiming that her skills were too modest for such distinguished company. Only after repeated encouragement had she agreed to play a simple piece by Mozart, apologizing in advance for any deficiencies in her execution. The performance that followed had been anything but simple. Her technique was flawless, her interpretation sophisticated, and her presence at the instrument commanding despite her professed humility. The piece she had chosen, a sonata in a minor, spoke of loss and longing with an emotional depth that left the audience silent when the final notes faded away. Blackwood had been among the first to approach her afterward, his compliments more genuine than any he had offered in years. "You do yourself a great injustice with such modesty," he had said, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. That was not merely accomplished, it was transcendent. Lady Vesper had accepted his praise with a blush that appeared entirely natural, though it had been carefully summoned through techniques learned from observing actresses at Drury Lane. "You are too kind, my lord. I fear I allowed my feelings to overcome proper restraint. There are memories associated with that piece that sometimes overwhelm my better judgment." The reference to private sorrow had been calculated to deepen his interest while establishing the foundation for future revelations. Blackwood, despite his worldly experience, found himself genuinely moved by what he interpreted as evidence of a sensitive nature capable of profound feeling. As the evening drew to a close, he had requested a private word with her in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with exotic plants that created an atmosphere both intimate and respectable. The scent of jasmine and orange blossoms provided a backdrop of sensual luxury, while moonlight streaming through the glass ceiling cast everything in silvery romance. "Lady Vesper," he had begun, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching awkwardness, "I hope you will not think me presumptuous, but I find myself compelled to speak. Your presence here has been a revelation, a reminder that there are still women in this world capable of combining beauty with genuine substance." She had listened with downcast eyes, her hands clasped before her in a gesture of modest attention that concealed the predatory satisfaction she felt at his obvious surrender to her carefully constructed appeal. "I am honored by your regard, Lord Blackwood," she had replied softly, "though I confess myself uncertain why you should find anything remarkable in one so unremarkably situated as myself." The profession of unworthiness had been perfectly pitched to invite contradiction, and Blackwood had responded as predictably as clockwork. He had spoken of her exceptional qualities, her rare combination of innocence and intelligence, her capacity to awaken feelings he had thought himself incapable of experiencing. Lady Vesper had accepted his words with apparent wonder, as if she had never been told of her own worth, as if his recognition was a gift beyond anything she had dared hope for. In reality, she was mentally cataloguing every weakness he revealed, every vulnerability he exposed, every emotional need that she could later exploit. When they parted that evening, Blackwood believed he had discovered a treasure beyond price. Lady Vesper knew she had captured her first victim, though the true nature of her trap remained hidden beneath layers of apparent sincerity that would take months to unravel. The game had begun in earnest, and already the first move had been played with devastating precision. The London season of 1816 opened with unprecedented grandeur, as if society itself sensed the momentous events that would unfold within its glittering confines. Lady Vesper had returned from the countryside with Blackwood's devoted attention secured, their correspondence during the winter months having cemented what he believed to be a profound emotional connection. His letters, carefully preserved in her private papers, revealed a man increasingly consumed by desires he had never expected to feel at his age. The Earl of Ashworth presented an entirely different challenge. Theodore Ashworth had built his political career on the ruins of lesser men's ambitions, his rise to power marked by a trail of broken promises and destroyed reputations. At 48, he possessed the lean build and hawk-like features of a natural predator, his dark eyes missing nothing while revealing even less. His weakness was not romantic sentiment but intellectual pride, the arrogance of a man who believed himself superior to every person he encountered. Lady Vesper had studied his political philosophy extensively, reading parliamentary records and newspaper accounts until she understood the complex web of beliefs and prejudices that drove his actions. Ashworth viewed the world as a vast chess game where human beings served as pieces to be manipulated for the greater glory of those intelligent enough to see the larger pattern. He despised weakness in any form and respected only those who demonstrated the strength to seize what they desired. Her approach to him required a complete transformation of strategy. Where she had appeared vulnerable and innocent with Blackwood, she now cultivated an image of intellectual sophistication tempered by feminine charm. She began attending political salons where ladies gathered to discuss the issues of the day, her contributions carefully calculated to demonstrate both knowledge and the kind of ruthless pragmatism that Ashworth found irresistible. Their first significant encounter occurred at Lady Pembroke's weekly salon, a gathering that attracted the most influential political minds in London. The topic under discussion was the proposed reform of the criminal code, a subject that allowed for the expression of various philosophical positions regarding justice, mercy, and the proper role of government in shaping society. Lady Vesper had positioned herself strategically near the fireplace, where the light flattered her complexion while allowing her to observe the entire room. She wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that suggested sophistication without ostentation, her jewelry consisting of garnets set in gold that caught the firelight with subtle brilliance. When the conversation turned to the question of capital punishment, she had offered an observation that cut through the polite platitudes surrounding the subject. Surely the question is not whether society has the right to take life, but whether it has the wisdom to distinguish between those who deserve mercy and those who represent an irremediable threat to civilized order. The comment had been deliberately provocative, suggesting a worldview that valued practical results over moral absolutes. Ashworth, who had been listening with the barely concealed boredom of a man accustomed to intellectual mediocrity, had suddenly focused his attention on this young woman who dared to speak of such matters with apparent understanding. "An interesting perspective, Lady Vesper," he had said, his voice carrying the tone of a professor acknowledging an unexpectedly promising student. "Might I inquire what leads you to such conclusions? They suggest a depth of consideration unusual in one of your years and circumstances." Lady Vesper had met his gaze directly, her own eyes reflecting the kind of steely determination that he recognized as kindred to his own nature. "I have observed that sentiment, however admirable in private life, often produces disastrous results when applied to public policy. A government that cannot act decisively in the face of clear threats will inevitably fall victim to those who suffer no such constraints." The exchange had established her as someone worthy of serious attention, a woman whose beauty was matched by an intelligence that grasped the harsh realities of political power. Over the following weeks, Ashworth had sought her opinion on various matters, initially as an intellectual exercise but gradually with increasing respect for her insights. Lady Vesper had carefully revealed her knowledge of classical political theory, discussing Machiavelli's principles with the same ease that other young ladies displayed when speaking of fashion. She demonstrated familiarity with contemporary European politics, offering analyses of Napoleon's defeat that showed understanding of both military strategy and diplomatic complexity. Most importantly, she had begun to hint at information that could prove valuable to his political ambitions. Her position as Duke Pemberton's daughter provided her access to conversations and correspondence that few others could claim. She spoke of dinner party discussions where cabinet ministers revealed their private opinions, of letters from foreign ambassadors that suggested opportunities for advantageous treaties, of financial intelligence that could prove crucial to policy decisions. Ashworth, whose entire career had been built on the strategic use of privileged information, recognized the potential value of such a source. Lady Vesper represented not merely an intellectually stimulating companion, but a possible pathway to intelligence that could elevate his influence to unprecedented levels. The seduction of Earl Ashworth required patience and subtlety far beyond what had been necessary with Blackwood. Where the Marquis had been conquered through appeals to his romantic nature, the Earl demanded proof of practical utility. Lady Vesper had to demonstrate that her beauty and intelligence were matched by a willingness to engage in the kind of moral compromises that he considered evidence of true sophistication. She began sharing carefully selected pieces of information gleaned from her father's correspondence, details that seemed insignificant but proved remarkably accurate when Ashworth tested them through his own sources. A comment about proposed changes to import duties, verified through Treasury contacts. An observation about potential shifts in foreign policy, confirmed through diplomatic channels. Each proven prediction increased her credibility while establishing her as an asset worth cultivating. The crucial moment came during a private dinner at Ashworth's London mansion, an austere establishment that reflected its owner's preference for function over ornament. The dining room, paneled in dark oak and lit by candles in simple silver holders, created an atmosphere of serious purpose that suited his temperament perfectly. Lady Vesper had been invited as one of 8 guests, a gathering that included several members of Parliament and their wives. The conversation ranged over topics of immediate political concern, from the state of the economy to the ongoing negotiations with various European powers seeking to establish new trade relationships. When the ladies withdrew after dinner, tradition dictated that they discuss lighter subjects while the gentlemen continued their political conversations over port and cigars. Lady Vesper had other plans, however, having arranged for a seemingly accidental encounter with Ashworth in his private study when he briefly excused himself from the masculine gathering. She had been examining a collection of political treatises when he entered, her presence in his private sanctuary creating an opportunity for intimacy that would have been impossible in more formal settings. The study, lined with books that showed evidence of actual reading rather than mere display, revealed aspects of his character that public appearances concealed. "I apologize for intruding," she had said, though her tone suggested anything but regret. "Your collection is remarkable, and I confess myself drawn to examine works that are rarely made available to ladies. This volume of Tacitus, for instance, contains marginalia that suggest insights I would never have considered." Ashworth had approached to examine the book she indicated, finding himself close enough to detect the subtle perfume she wore, a scent of jasmine and sandalwood that seemed to embody both innocence and experience. Her finger traced the Latin text with obvious familiarity, her translation revealing not only linguistic skill but understanding of the historical context that gave the words their meaning. "Few men of my acquaintance demonstrate such appreciation for classical authors," he had observed, his usual cynicism tempered by genuine interest. "Your education appears to have been remarkably comprehensive." Lady Vesper had turned to face him fully, her proximity making conversation feel suddenly intimate despite the formal setting. "My mother believed that understanding the past was essential to navigating the present. She insisted that I study not merely what history teaches us to admire, but what it reveals about the methods by which power is gained and maintained." The reference to her mother had been calculated to remind him of his failure to act when Lady Catherine's suffering had been evident to all who chose to see it. Lady Vesper watched his face carefully, noting the slight tightening of his expression that suggested discomfort with the memory. "Lady Catherine was indeed a woman of exceptional intelligence," he had replied carefully. "Her insights into human nature were particularly acute. I confess I sometimes wonder what she might have accomplished had circumstances been different." The admission represented the closest thing to acknowledgement of complicity that Lady Vesper was likely to receive. She filed it away for future use while maintaining her expression of innocent curiosity. "I often wonder the same," she had said softly. "There are times when I feel that her spirit guides my own understanding, as if she continues to teach me through some mysterious connection that death cannot sever." The suggestion of supernatural communication had clearly disturbed Ashworth, whose rational nature rejected such possibilities while his guilty conscience made them seem uncomfortably plausible. The idea that the dead might speak through the living, that past failures might demand future reckonings, introduced an element of uncertainty into his carefully ordered worldview. Lady Vesper had seized upon his discomfort to deepen the psychological pressure. She spoke of dreams where her mother appeared with urgent messages she could never quite remember upon waking, of moments when she felt compelled to pursue courses of action that seemed to serve purposes beyond her conscious understanding. "There are times," she had whispered, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality, "when I feel that I am merely an instrument of forces greater than myself, that my actions serve ends I cannot fully comprehend. It is both terrifying and strangely comforting to believe that we are not alone in our struggles against injustice." The word injustice had been carefully chosen for its moral implications, suggesting that some cosmic balance required correction, that debts remained unpaid and accounts unsettled. Ashworth, despite his cynicism, found himself genuinely unsettled by the intensity of her conviction and the possibility that his own actions might have contributed to the cosmic imbalance she described. When they rejoined the other guests, Lady Vesper had successfully established herself as a figure of both intellectual fascination and vague supernatural menace. Ashworth found himself thinking about her words long after the evening ended, disturbed by implications he could not quite dismiss despite his rational skepticism. Over the following months, their relationship deepened through a series of increasingly intimate conversations that revealed layers of complexity neither had initially suspected in the other. Lady Vesper continued to provide valuable intelligence while demonstrating a philosophical ruthlessness that Ashworth found both attractive and slightly unsettling. She had begun to speak more openly about her belief that certain people deserved punishment for their crimes against the innocent, that justice sometimes required methods that conventional morality would condemn. Her words carried implications that went far beyond abstract philosophical discussion, suggesting a willingness to act upon principles that most people would consider only in theoretical terms. Ashworth, whose own career had been built upon the principle that the ends justified the means, found himself simultaneously attracted to and threatened by a woman who seemed to embody his own philosophy while possessing the beauty and apparent innocence to make such ruthlessness seem almost divine in its purpose. The trap was closing around him as surely as it had around Blackwood, though he remained convinced that he was the hunter rather than the prey. Lady Vesper's reputation for wisdom and insight had grown throughout London society, making her opinions increasingly sought after by men who believed themselves immune to feminine manipulation. She had become something unprecedented in their world, a woman whose beauty served not as her primary weapon but as camouflage for intelligence and determination that rivaled any man's. The game was entering its most dangerous phase, where the stakes would rise beyond mere social embarrassment to encompass complete destruction of everything her targets had spent their lives building. The spring of 1816 brought with it a series of scandals that rocked London society to its very foundations, each revelation more devastating than the last. Lady Vesper's campaign of revenge had entered its most lethal phase, as the carefully planted seeds of the previous months began to bloom into a garden of destruction that would consume her enemies with systematic precision. Marquis Blackwood had fallen first, his ruin orchestrated with such subtle artistry that even he failed to recognize his destroyer until the final moments of his downfall. The financial empire he had spent decades building crumbled within the space of a single week, brought low by a series of investments that had seemed brilliantly conceived but proved to be catastrophically flawed. Lady Vesper had spent months studying his business practices, learning the intricate web of international finance that sustained his various enterprises. She discovered that his success depended largely upon information received ahead of his competitors, intelligence that allowed him to position his investments to maximum advantage before market conditions shifted in predictable directions. Using her access to diplomatic correspondence through her father's connections, she had begun feeding Blackwood carefully crafted misinformation disguised as privileged intelligence. A letter mentioning potential changes in trade agreements with the East India Company, seemingly genuine but containing subtle inaccuracies that would prove devastating when acted upon. A casual reference to political developments in Europe that suggested investment opportunities in shipping ventures that were actually doomed to failure. Each piece of false information had been presented as if shared in strictest confidence, their apparent reliability enhanced by her previous track record of accuracy. Blackwood, whose romantic infatuation had compromised his usually shrewd judgment, had acted upon her intelligence without conducting the thorough verification that had previously protected him from similar traps. The coup de grace had been delivered through a forged letter purportedly from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, hinting at government contracts that would revolutionize the textile industry. The letter, created using techniques learned from studying genuine correspondence in her father's files, had been convincing enough to persuade Blackwood to invest virtually his entire liquid capital in manufacturing ventures that existed only on paper. When the truth emerged, his financial position had become untenable virtually overnight. Banks that had previously competed for his custom now demanded immediate repayment of outstanding loans. Business partners who had courted his favor abandoned him with unseemly haste. The mansion that had been his pride became a liability he could no longer afford to maintain. Lady Vesper had observed his destruction with the cold satisfaction of a scientist, recording the results of a successful experiment. She attended the auction of his possessions, watching as strangers bid on artwork and furniture that had once formed the backdrop to his arrogant displays of wealth. The irony was exquisite. The man who had built his fortune by manipulating others had been destroyed by manipulation so subtle that he never suspected its true nature. But Blackwood's ruin was merely the prelude to a more complex symphony of destruction. Earl Ashworth's downfall required different methods, his political power making him vulnerable to entirely different forms of attack. Lady Vesper had spent months cultivating sources within his circle of associates, identifying the ambitious subordinates, whose loyalty could be purchased with the promise of advancement. The key had been discovering Ashworth's secret relationship with foreign agents, correspondence that revealed his willingness to sell English interests for personal gain. Lady Vesper had gained access to these letters through a carefully orchestrated seduction of his private secretary, a young man whose romantic inexperience made him pathetically easy to manipulate. Using techniques learned from observing the most accomplished courtesans of London society, she had convinced the secretary that she was desperately in love with him while maintaining an appearance of virtuous resistance to his advances. The poor fool had stolen the incriminating documents as proof of his devotion, believing that their exposure would somehow advance their impossible romance. Lady Vesper had copies made of the most damaging correspondence before arranging for the originals to be discovered by a member of Parliament, whose rivalry with Ashworth was well known. The revelation that a sitting earl had been selling state secrets to foreign powers created a scandal that made his continued presence in government impossible. The parliamentary inquiry that followed had been a masterpiece of public humiliation. Ashworth, forced to defend himself against charges that were both true and provable, had watched his political career evaporate under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. His attempt to implicate others in his treasonous activities had only deepened the scandal, making him appear not merely corrupt but cowardly in his willingness to sacrifice former allies to save himself. Lady Vesper had attended every session of the inquiry, her presence in the public gallery a constant reminder of the moral authority that her apparent innocence lent to the proceedings. When Ashworth's eyes met hers across the crowded chamber, she had offered him the same gentle smile that had once seemed to promise intellectual companionship and romantic possibility. The recognition of his true situation had dawned in his expression like sunrise over a battlefield, revealing the extent of his defeat while illuminating the skill of his conqueror. He had been played by a master whose abilities far exceeded his own, destroyed by methods so sophisticated that his admiration for their artistry almost outweighed his rage at their application. Viscount Whitmore had proven more challenging, his legal expertise making him naturally suspicious of the kind of traps that had ensnared his colleagues. Lady Vesper had been forced to employ more direct methods, using his position as a judge to create situations where his own corruption would become undeniably apparent to the legal community he had spent his career deceiving. The key had been his gambling debts, obligations that far exceeded his official income and could only be sustained through the kind of judicial decisions that favored certain parties in exchange for appropriate consideration. Lady Vesper had gained access to his private financial records through a carefully cultivated friendship with his banker's wife, a lonely woman whose hunger for sophisticated conversation made her indiscreet about her husband's business affairs. Armed with evidence of Whitmore's financial irregularities, Lady Vesper had arranged for several of his most questionable judicial decisions to be reviewed by higher courts. The pattern of corruption that emerged from this scrutiny had been impossible to ignore, particularly when combined with documentation of payments that corresponded exactly to the timing of favorable verdicts. The judicial inquiry that followed had been swift and merciless. Whitmore's attempts to defend his decisions on legal grounds had crumbled under examination by colleagues who understood the law far better than the political considerations that had motivated his corruption. His removal from the bench had been accompanied by criminal charges that threatened to result in imprisonment and complete social ostracism. Lady Vesper had observed his disgrace from the gallery of the Court of King's Bench, her presence lending an air of moral authority to the proceedings that made his fall seem almost divinely ordained. When their eyes met during his final day of testimony, she had inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement of a worthy opponent's defeat, a gesture that conveyed both respect for his abilities and satisfaction at their ultimate insufficiency. Baron Fitzgerald had watched the destruction of his associates with growing alarm, his control over England's shipping interests making him acutely aware that he too was vulnerable to the mysterious force that seemed to be systematically targeting his circle. His attempts to identify their common enemy had been frustrated by the apparent randomness of their individual downfalls, each ruin seeming to stem from entirely different causes and methods. Lady Vesper had saved him for last precisely because his paranoid nature would make him the most dangerous once he realized the true nature of the threat they faced. She had allowed him to exhaust himself in futile investigations while she prepared the most elaborate trap of her entire campaign, a web of destruction so complex that its true architect would remain hidden even after its devastating effects became apparent. The weapon she chose against Fitzgerald was his own fleet, the ships that had made his fortune through carrying cargo that sometimes existed only on manifests designed to defraud insurance companies and government tax collectors. Lady Vesper had spent months documenting his various fraudulent schemes, creating a dossier that revealed patterns of criminal activity stretching back over decades. But rather than simply exposing his crimes, she had chosen to engineer their exposure through methods that would appear to result from natural consequences rather than deliberate sabotage. Using her knowledge of shipping schedules and weather patterns, she had arranged for several of his most valuable vessels to encounter difficulties that would force them to undergo inspections by customs officials who had been anonymously informed about discrepancies in their cargo manifests. The investigations that followed had uncovered a network of corruption that implicated dozens of merchants, shipowners, and government officials in schemes that had cost the Crown thousands of pounds in lost revenue. Fitzgerald's attempts to destroy incriminating evidence had been anticipated and countered. His own paranoid security measures turned against him through careful manipulation of the very subordinates he had trusted to protect his secrets. When the final indictments were handed down, Baron Fitzgerald found himself facing not merely financial ruin but criminal prosecution on charges that carried the possibility of transportation to the penal colonies of Australia. His fleet had been seized by the Crown, his assets frozen pending resolution of the criminal proceedings, and his reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of redemption. Lady Vesper had attended his trial with the same serene composure that had marked her presence at the downfall of his associates. When the guilty verdict was announced, she had closed her eyes briefly in what observers interpreted as a prayer of thanksgiving for justice finally served. In reality, she was savoring the moment of complete victory, the satisfaction of seeing the last of her mother's betrayers face the consequences of their moral failures. The systematic destruction of Duke Pemberton's inner circle had been accomplished without any of the victims understanding the true nature of their defeat. They had fallen not to random misfortune or professional incompetence, but to the calculated vengeance of a woman whose apparent innocence had concealed intelligence and ruthlessness that exceeded their own. London society, reeling from the rapid succession of scandals that had toppled some of its most powerful figures, searched desperately for explanations that could restore their faith in the stability of their world. Some spoke of divine justice finally catching up with men whose crimes had long been concealed by wealth and position. Others suggested that the rapid social changes following the end of the Napoleonic Wars had created opportunities for previously hidden corruptions to be exposed. None suspected that a single individual could have orchestrated such comprehensive destruction, particularly not a young woman whose reputation for virtue and intelligence had made her one of society's most admired figures. Lady Vesper had achieved the perfect crime, a vengeance so complete that it appeared to be the work of Providence itself, visiting justice upon the wicked through means too sophisticated for mortal minds to comprehend. But her ultimate target remained untouched, watching the destruction of his associates with the calculating eyes of a survivor who understood that his own reckoning was yet to come. Duke Pemberton had not achieved his position through carelessness or sentiment, and he would not fall as easily as the men who had believed themselves his equals. The final act of Lady Vesper's revenge would require all of her accumulated skills and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. Duke Alexander Pemberton stood at the windows of his study, gazing out at the manicured gardens of Grosvenor Square while contemplating the systematic destruction of his closest associates. The autumn of 1816 had brought with it a chill that seemed to penetrate more than mere flesh, settling into the bones of a man who had finally begun to understand that he was not merely witnessing a series of unfortunate coincidences, but observing the methodical execution of a plan whose scope and sophistication exceeded anything he had previously encountered. The study that surrounded him represented 40 years of accumulated power and influence. Maps of his various estates covered one wall, their boundaries marking territories that had been in Pemberton hands for 6 generations. Portraits of ancestors looked down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge the current heir's ability to preserve what they had built through centuries of careful marriage alliances and political maneuvering. But the room's most significant feature was a locked cabinet containing correspondence that revealed the true extent of his influence over English politics and society. Letters from cabinet ministers seeking his support for various policies, documents outlining financial arrangements that had shaped the course of legislation, records of conversations where the fate of lesser men had been decided with casual indifference to their humanity. Among these papers lay the most dangerous documents of all. Letters written in his late wife's increasingly desperate hand, communications that revealed the systematic campaign of psychological torture he had conducted against the woman who had made the mistake of loving him with genuine devotion. Lady Catherine's words, preserved in his private files like trophies of conquest, chronicled her gradual descent into despair as she realized that the man she had married was incapable of returning even the smallest measure of the affection she offered so freely. The Duke had kept these letters not from sentiment, but from a combination of vanity and caution. They served as reminders of his complete dominance over someone who had once dared to believe herself his equal, while their existence provided insurance against any future accusations that might threaten his reputation. He had calculated that no one would ever dare to accuse him of driving his wife to suicide, but if such charges were ever leveled, these documents would prove that her death resulted from feminine weakness rather than masculine cruelty. What he had failed to consider was the possibility that someone might possess both the intelligence to understand their true significance and the determination to use them as weapons in a campaign of revenge that would make his own cruelties seem like childish pranks by comparison. "I have always valued honesty above all other virtues, father," she had replied softly. "Perhaps because I learned from my mother's example how devastating dishonesty can be to those who love unwisely." The reference to Lady Catherine had been deliberate, a clear signal that they were no longer engaged in casual conversation, but in the kind of deadly serious dialogue that would determine which of them would emerge victorious from a conflict that had been building for 3 years. Duke Pemberton had felt a chill of recognition as he realized that his assessment of his daughter's capabilities had been catastrophically inadequate. The young woman sitting across from him was not the malleable instrument he had believed her to be, but something far more dangerous. An enemy who had been studying his weaknesses while concealing her own strengths behind a mask of filial devotion. "Your mother was a woman of excessive sensibility," he had said, probing for the emotional reactions that would reveal the extent of her knowledge and the depth of her commitment to whatever purpose was driving her actions. She allowed her feelings to overcome her judgment, ultimately destroying herself through an inability to accept the realities of adult life. Lady Vesper had smiled at his characterization, her expression conveying the kind of gentle pity that one might feel for someone whose understanding was limited by fundamental moral blindness. "Mother's letters tell a rather different story," she had said quietly, watching his face for the moment when he would understand that his most carefully guarded secrets had been discovered and weaponized against him. "They reveal a woman whose capacity for love was systematically exploited by someone who viewed her devotion as weakness to be punished rather than a gift to be treasured." The revelation that she possessed Lady Catherine's private correspondence had struck Duke Pemberton like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the possibility that his daughter had access to evidence that could destroy not merely his reputation but his life. The letters contained admissions that would be interpreted as evidence of deliberate psychological torture, descriptions of cruelties that would make him appear monstrous to anyone who read them with the knowledge that they had ultimately driven their author to suicide. "Those letters were destroyed," he had said, his voice betraying the first signs of genuine fear that Lady Vesper had ever heard from him. "I supervised their disposal personally after your mother's death." Lady Vesper had reached into her reticule and withdrawn a folded paper, placing it on the table between them with the casual gesture of someone playing a winning card in a game whose outcome had never been in doubt. "You destroyed copies, father," she had said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had finally been able to reveal the true extent of her preparations. Mother, in her desperation, had begun secreting the originals in places where she hoped someone might eventually discover them and understand what had really happened to her. Duke Pemberton had unfolded the paper with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing his late wife's handwriting immediately. The passage his eyes fell upon was one of the most damning, describing in heartbreaking detail how his systematic cruelties had destroyed her will to live while making her death seem like the only escape from unbearable suffering. "What do you want?" he had asked, the question acknowledging that their relationship had fundamentally changed, that he was no longer dealing with his obedient daughter but with an adversary whose capabilities he had gravely underestimated. Lady Vesper had leaned forward slightly, her green eyes reflecting the candlelight in a way that made them seem to burn with inner fire. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who held absolute power over another person's fate. "I want you to understand, Father, that justice delayed is not justice denied. I want you to know that everything you valued most in this world, your power, your reputation, your sense of superiority over those you deemed inferior, can be taken away as easily as you took away my mother's reason for living." The words had been delivered without anger or hatred, their clinical precision making them far more terrifying than any emotional outburst could have been. Duke Pemberton, looking into his daughter's face, had realized that he was confronting something unprecedented in his experience, an opponent whose intelligence matched his own while being unrestrained by the moral limitations that had always provided him with predictable advantages over his enemies. The game had entered its final phase, with predator and prey finally face to face, their true natures revealed, and the ultimate stakes clearly understood by both participants. The winter of 1817 brought with it a transformation of London society so complete that future historians would mark it as the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely new. The systematic destruction of the Pemberton dynasty had created a vacuum of power that lesser families rushed to fill, their ambitions checked only by the growing awareness that the methods used to topple such established authority could be employed against anyone who attracted the wrong kind of attention. Duke Pemberton had spent the months following his confrontation with Lady Vesper attempting to construct defenses against an enemy whose capabilities seemed to expand with each passing day. He had hired bodyguards, investigators, and even consulted practitioners of the occult arts, desperate to protect himself against attacks that came from directions he could neither predict nor counter effectively. But Lady Vesper's final assault had not taken the form he expected. Rather than exposing his crimes through dramatic revelation or orchestrating his ruin through financial manipulation, she had chosen a method that was both more subtle and more devastating than anything she had previously employed. She had begun to tell the truth. The campaign had started with seemingly innocent conversations in London's most fashionable drawing rooms, where Lady Vesper would speak with profound sadness about her father's grief following her mother's death. She described a man so consumed by guilt over his failure to recognize the depth of his wife's suffering that he had withdrawn from society, tormented by the knowledge that his devotion to business and politics had blinded him to the cry for help that his beloved Catherine had been too proud to voice directly. The portrayal of Duke Pemberton as a man destroyed by remorse for his emotional blindness had been masterful in its apparent generosity. Lady Vesper spoke of him with the kind of loving concern that a devoted daughter might feel for a father whose noble nature had been corrupted by excessive self-blame. She shared carefully selected details about his private anguish, his sleepless nights, his inability to enjoy the pleasures that had once brought him satisfaction. Society, always eager for stories that confirmed their romantic beliefs about love conquering all obstacles, had embraced this narrative with enthusiasm. Duke Pemberton was transformed from a figure of intimidating power into an object of sympathetic understanding, a man whose very success had prevented him from appreciating the treasure he possessed until it was too late to preserve it. The genius of this approach lay in its fundamental accuracy combined with complete misinterpretation of motive. Duke Pemberton was indeed consumed by thoughts of his dead wife, but his obsession stemmed from fear of exposure rather than grief for her loss. His withdrawal from society reflected not romantic anguish but calculating paranoia about his daughter's intentions. His sleepless nights were caused not by regret for missed opportunities to express love, but by terror at the realization that he was being systematically destroyed by someone whose capabilities he had never suspected. Lady Vesper had supplemented these public performances with private conversations that revealed carefully measured portions of the truth about her family's domestic situation. She spoke to trusted confidants about discovering her mother's private papers, documents that revealed the depth of Lady Catherine's unhappiness in the months before her death. She shared selected passages that painted a picture of a woman who felt increasingly isolated from a husband whose business concerns had made him inattentive to her emotional needs. The letters she chose to reveal were genuine but incomplete, their context manipulated to support the narrative of tragic misunderstanding rather than deliberate cruelty. They spoke of loneliness and despair but omitted the specific incidents of psychological torture that had driven Lady Catherine to her ultimate decision. They revealed a woman who felt unloved but concealed the systematic campaign of humiliation that had convinced her that death was preferable to continued existence. The effect on London society had been profound. Duke Pemberton, previously viewed as a figure of intimidating competence, became an object of pity whose apparent grief made him seem more human and therefore more vulnerable than he had ever appeared before. Former enemies began to approach him with offers of friendship and support, their sympathy making them dangerously indiscreet about their own secrets and vulnerabilities. Lady Vesper had exploited this changed dynamic to gather intelligence about the remaining power structures of London society, identifying the men and women whose influence had filled the vacuum created by the fall of her father's associates. She cultivated relationships with their wives and daughters, her reputation for wisdom and discretion making her a sought-after confidant for people who needed someone to listen to their troubles without judgment or betrayal. But her most devastating revelation had been saved for last, delivered during the height of the 1817 season at a ball given by the Duchess of Marlborough to celebrate her daughter's engagement. The event had attracted the most influential members of society, their presence creating the perfect audience for the final act of Lady Vesper's carefully orchestrated drama. She had appeared in a gown of midnight blue silk that made her seem to float across the ballroom like a figure from a romantic painting. Her jewelry consisted of her mother's diamonds, reset in a new design that caught the candlelight with brilliant fire. The effect was both stunning and somehow ethereal, as if she had emerged from a realm where justice and beauty were synonymous. The crucial moment had come during the traditional toast to the engaged couple, when Lady Vesper had been called upon to offer words of wisdom as one of society's most admired young women. She had risen gracefully, accepting a glass of champagne while the assembled company fell silent in anticipation of remarks that would undoubtedly reflect her reputation for intelligent insight. "Your Grace, distinguished guests," she had begun, her voice carrying clearly across the crowded ballroom. "We gather tonight to celebrate the beginning of a new life built upon the foundation of mutual love and respect. Such occasions remind us that true happiness can only be achieved when two souls unite not merely in name but in genuine understanding of each other's needs and aspirations." The opening had been conventional enough to meet the expectations of her audience while establishing themes that would take on increasing significance as her remarks continued. "I have learned through painful experience," she had continued, her voice taking on a note of profound sadness that commanded complete attention, "that marriages built upon deception and indifference inevitably become prisons for those who enter them with honest hearts. My dear mother, Lady Catherine Pemberton, taught me this lesson through her own tragic example." The mention of her mother had created a ripple of sympathetic attention throughout the room, as everyone present was aware of the supposedly romantic tragedy that had befallen the Pemberton family. "She left behind letters," Lady Vesper had said, her words falling into a silence so complete that her voice seemed to echo from the painted ceiling, "correspondence that reveals the true cost of loving someone incapable of returning such devotion. They tell the story of a woman who discovered that the man she had married viewed her affection as weakness to be exploited rather than a gift to be treasured." The assembled company had begun to shift uncomfortably as they realized that Lady Vesper's remarks were taking an unexpectedly dark turn, moving beyond conventional wedding toast sentiments into territory that seemed dangerously personal. "These letters describe systematic campaigns of humiliation designed to destroy my mother's self-worth," Lady Vesper had continued, her voice remaining steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "They detail how a woman's natural desire for companionship was treated as evidence of inadequacy, how her expressions of love were met with calculated cruelty designed to make her question her own sanity." Duke Pemberton, standing near the back of the ballroom, had felt the eyes of the assembled company begin to turn toward him as the implications of his daughter's words became clear. The romantic tragedy that had enhanced his reputation was being systematically dismantled, replaced by a far more sinister narrative that cast him as the villain rather than the victim of circumstances beyond his control. "My mother's final letters," Lady Vesper had said, her voice taking on the quality of someone delivering a sacred pronouncement, "reveal that she chose death not because of illness or accident, but because she could no longer endure living with someone who had convinced her that her very existence was a burden upon those she loved most." The revelation had struck the assembled company with the force of a physical blow, creating an atmosphere of shocked silence that seemed to drain all warmth from the glittering ballroom. Duke Pemberton, suddenly understanding the true scope of his daughter's plan, had attempted to approach her, but found his path blocked by guests whose expressions had already begun to reflect their revision of everything they thought they knew about the Pemberton family tragedy. "I share these painful truths," Lady Vesper had concluded, raising her champagne glass in a gesture that transformed the traditional toast into something approaching a religious ceremony, not to diminish tonight's celebration, but to remind us all that genuine love requires courage to be vulnerable, wisdom to be kind, and strength to be gentle. May this couple find in each other what my poor mother sought but never received, a partner whose love grows stronger rather than weaker when tested by life's inevitable challenges. The toast had been drunk in an atmosphere of profound discomfort, as the assembled company struggled to process revelations that transformed their understanding of one of society's most prominent families. Duke Pemberton had found himself isolated in a crowd of people who no longer knew how to regard him, their former respect replaced by a mixture of horror and fascination that made normal social interaction impossible. In the days that followed, Lady Vesper's revelations had spread throughout London society with the speed of wildfire, each retelling adding new details and interpretations that made Duke Pemberton appear increasingly monstrous. The romantic tragedy that had enhanced his reputation was replaced by a scandal that made his continued presence in polite society impossible. But the most devastating consequence had been the complete reversal of their relationship dynamics. Duke Pemberton, who had spent his entire adult life as the hunter, suddenly found himself cast permanently in the role of prey. Every social gathering became an ordeal where his presence created discomfort, every business meeting an opportunity for former associates to distance themselves from someone whose reputation had become too toxic to ignore. Lady Vesper, meanwhile, had emerged as a figure of almost mythical authority, her courage in revealing painful family secrets transforming her into a symbol of justice finally served. Society's most influential women sought her counsel on matters ranging from domestic difficulties to political questions, recognizing in her someone who possessed both the intelligence to understand complex situations and the moral authority to offer guidance based on hard-won wisdom. The final irony had been Duke Pemberton's gradual realization that his daughter had achieved something he had always considered impossible. She had destroyed him without breaking a single law, committed treason against his authority without committing any crime that could be prosecuted in court. Her weapon had been truth, carefully selected and artfully presented, but genuine nonetheless. As the season of 1817 drew to a close, Duke Pemberton found himself facing a future that bore no resemblance to anything he had previously imagined possible. His political influence had evaporated as former allies sought to avoid association with his scandal. His business interests had been compromised as partners withdrew from arrangements that might reflect poorly on their own reputations. His social position had become untenable as invitations ceased arriving and former friends crossed streets to avoid uncomfortable encounters. Lady Vesper had achieved her revenge not through violence or illegal manipulation, but through the simple expedient of ensuring that truth finally overcame the lies that had sustained her father's position for so many years. She had proven that justice delayed was not justice denied, that patience and intelligence could accomplish what anger and haste never could. Standing in the window of his study as autumn returned to London, Duke Pemberton contemplated the systematic destruction of everything he had spent his life building. The maps of his estates still covered the walls, but many of those properties would soon be sold to pay debts that mounted daily as his sources of income disappeared. The portraits of his ancestors still gazed down from their frames, but their painted eyes seemed to reproach him for failing to preserve what they had built through centuries of careful planning and strategic marriage. In the locked cabinet, Lady Catherine's letters remained as evidence of crimes that could never be prosecuted but would never be forgotten. Her daughter had ensured that the truth would outlive them all, that future generations would understand the real cost of power exercised without conscience, love offered without reciprocation, and justice deferred but never abandoned. Lady Vesper Pemberton had destroyed a dynasty using exactly the weapons her title had promised. Lies transformed into truth, seduction revealed as justice, and silence finally broken to ensure that the innocent dead would speak through the living until the very end of time. The game was over, and she had won completely.